Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for another installment of our Process and Practice series with the artist Shervone Neckles. My name is Hannah Katz, and I am the Grant and Education Manager here at Dieu Donné. I use she, her pronouns. Dieu Donné is the leading cultural nonprofit organization dedicated to serving emerging and established artists through the collaborative creation of contemporary art using the process of hand papermaking. Based in Brooklyn, our programming includes residencies, fellowships, and workspace opportunities for artists, workshops and educational programming for all ages, and exhibitions and publications. In this webinar, you can turn on automated captions by clicking the closed captions button. Please use the Q&A function to submit questions throughout the talk, and we'll come back to all of your questions at the end. It's really helpful to submit questions throughout the talk because then they're ready for us when we start the Q&A. And finally, I'm honored to introduce today's speakers. Shervone Neckles is an interdisciplinary artist making embellished textiles, prints, sculptures, installations, and public art to retell Afro-Caribbean histories and mythologies. Her multimedia installation, An Examination of Self and Memory, was featured in the 2019 Venice Biennale's Grenada Pavilion. She also recently created an outdoor installation at the Lewis Latimer House Museum to commemorate the life and legacy of the African-American inventor, which has traveled to downtown Brooklyn, the Museum of Science in Boston, and Chelsea City Hall in Massachusetts. In 2022 and 2023, her work was presented in a solo exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Jacksonville in Florida, in a group exhibition at Moore College in Philadelphia, and she was a workspace resident here at Dieu Donné. Shervone recently debuted a permanent public art installation, The Lunar Portal, at the University of Pittsburgh Mercy Pavilion Plaza. In 2024, she has a forthcoming public art installation with the Metropolitan Transportation Authority in the Bronx. And Tatiana Ginsberg is the Director of Artistic Projects and Master Collaborator at Dieu Donné. She studied papermaking and book arts at the University of Iowa Center for the Book and received her MFA from the University of California, Santa Barbara. In between, she spent 2 years in Japan researching naturally dyed papers under a Fulbright grant. Returning to the US, she taught papermaking, printmaking, and book arts and drawing in universities for more than a decade. As Director of Artistic Projects and Master Collaborator at Dieu Donné, she works with other artists to make new work in handmade paper. She also edits the series Papermaker's Tears, Essays on the Art and Craft of Paper for Legacy Press. Her own work combines traditional and contemporary methods of papermaking and is exhibited nationally and internationally. So without further ado, welcome to Shervone and Tatiana.
Thank you, Hannah. And I'm so excited to be here today with Shervone. Just before we let her take it away, I thought I would just say a little something about our Workspace program. Workspace is one of our the programs that's very close to our heart. We take currently 4 artists a year by open application. It's a blind jury, so every year the jury is different, and we encourage all New York State-based artists to apply. So Shervone and I worked together in 2021 and 2022 for her Workspace Residency. And that consists of 5 days in the studio and lots of conversations, meetings, back and forth exchanges, as well as an orientation and workshop before all that. So most of the handmade paper works that you're going to see in this presentation, she made during her residency. And then she's continued working in paper, and she'll tell you a little bit more about that as part of her talk. So welcome, Shervone, and thank you for being here today with us.
Oh, thank you so much. I really do appreciate you all having me here as part of this Artist Talk series. I appreciate your opening remarks, Hannah, as well as Tatiana. Thank you so much. And also, I want to express my appreciation to the Dieu Donné team for this opportunity as well, and also show a lot of love and appreciation to all the folks joining us today, carving out time out of your schedules to participate. And I'm really looking forward to sharing my work with you all, but also answering your questions towards the end of the presentation. But before we begin, what I thought I'd do is actually just share with you all how I've organized the presentation. So we're going to start with me just showing some images of my work, and I'll be talking about some of the inspirations and motivations for the work that I do. So I won't go into detail about all the things that you're seeing on screen at the moment, but just more about the motivations for why I'm doing what I'm doing. And then that will segue into me sharing about a specific installation that I did right before I started the Dieu Donné residency. And then that will then segue us into the explorations and collaboration that I did at Dieu Donné with Tatiana. And then once I share that, I'll invite Tatiana to join in the conversation, and we chat a bit before we open it up to Q&A. So I hope that sounds good to everyone. All right, so then without further ado, let's get started. So I wanted to start here. As Tatiana mentioned, I've continued a lot of my paper exploration, my paper making explorations. This is me just a few weeks ago. I am at Anna Benjamin's studio in Philadelphia. I was introduced to Anna Benjamin through Dieu Donné. She was also trained through Dieu Donné. And they introduced me because I wanted to continue a lot of the explorations that I started at Dieu Donné. So this is me here. And as you can see, with a smile on my face, I'm enjoying myself. But I just wanted to show how this work continues. I am very much excited about this material and want to continue to explore all the possibilities. So I wanted to also just share a little bit about where I draw a lot of my inspiration from. So I draw a lot of inspiration from being a first generation, Afro-Caribbean-American woman that was raised in a very densely populated Caribbean pocket of Flatbush, Brooklyn. And I was raised by two young Grenadian parents who had migrated to the United States in the late 70s. This is them here. And so because I grew up in a very Caribbean household, that really framed my formative years. It informed how I would just move and operate in the world. And because, like I said before, my parents were young parents, my mom was in her late teens, my father was in his early 20s when they migrated to the United States and settled in New York. My mom would arrive first, and then a few months later, she would have me, and then my father would arrive a year later. And so I like to say that we grew up together and we had to make sense of the world together and create a sense of place and belonging for ourselves. And so what you're seeing here is my first graduation, kindergarten graduation in Brooklyn at, I think this graduation was at Mahalia Jackson's high school in East Flatbush. And so I tell a lot of stories through a range of materials. I use a lot of craft traditions that were learned from the women in my family. So applique, embroidery, weaving, beading, textiles. I tell all kinds of stories through these mediums. I also work in assemblage, printmaking, sculpture, multimedia installations, and most recently, public art. And through all of these mediums, I'm weaving together my Afro-Caribbean, Grenadian aesthetics, expressions, and sensibilities with my American identity, and then also just my personal interest in like history, nature, and the sciences. And so it's from that that I'm then able to explore concepts like ancestral memory and loss, as you're seeing here. And so what you're seeing here is a detail from my Where Ends Meet installation. It's a digital reproduction of my maternal grandmother. This is her in her late teens, early 20s. This is like circa 1945. It's a hand woven print, and it's a double-sided print. So on the back side is me in my teenage years, and it's printed on a brown paper bag surface. This is one of 3 double prints that's displayed hanging in front of a reproduction of a French plantation ledger from Grenada in circa early 1700s. And this was researched at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem. And so along with exploring concepts like ancestral memory and loss, I also explore identity narratives in my work as well, so from my own kind of interiority. So my Black girlhood to womanhood to now even motherhood journey. And then I also even explore in my work my place or my position in my family, right? That definitely becomes a topic of conversation. I am the first child of my parents. I am the first granddaughter on both my maternal and paternal side of the family. And, that role comes with, responsibility, expectations. And so I see it as a form of labor, and it definitely informs how I see the world and how I operate in the world. So it is a topic of conversation. This here is Wet Nurse and Young Master. And this is from my Granny's wallpaper series. It's inspired by the Charlotte Perkins Gilman short story called The Yellow Wallpaper. And it's also inspired by Jamaica Kincaid's novel Lucy. And this image in particular draws from the Missouri Historical Museum's photo collection from the 1800s. And it is, the original is actually of an enslaved woman by the name of Louisa. And the original shows Louisa holding the son of George and Ellen Hayward. And George and Helen purchased Louisa in 1858 for the sole purpose of caring for their son, Harry. So what you're seeing here is me removing baby Harry and placing a baby picture of myself in the arms of Louisa. So this series and a lot of my other work is really about exploring these, identities, identities getting kind of getting lost and obscured in the surface of, or beneath the surface of the wallpaper in this series in particular. But also my work contemplates the history of domestic labor, right? And especially in the context of the migrants' first experience coming to the United States and the first forms of employment that migrants have access to, which is always mostly around domestic labor, and how those positions tend to have roots that trace back to involuntary servitude as well as slavery. So along with exploring, self-identity narratives, I also explore a lot in my work the tension that I feel around being a first-generation American in America, right? There's just this desire for me to celebrate and honor my Grenadian heritage at all times. There's this cultural preservation that's just necessary for me. But then in reality, there's always this weight that I also feel around these cultural expectations, right? And so I want to express that in the work. There's a tension that I feel or I hold for these two places that I consider my home, both Grenada and the United States. Sometimes one country is referred to as a small island or a small country or a developing country. And even to this day, some people still use third world country, while the other home is considered this global world power. And so in just our descriptions alone, right, the language that we use, we're creating these power dynamics that creates these tensions between these two countries. And it informs and impacts how one sees or views their home. And then there's also these personal tensions that I have about these two places that I call home too, right? I was born in the United States. I am an American citizen, but I don't always feel like I'm welcomed or I belong here, right? And then when I go home to my ancestral country, my homeland, Grenada, because I just carry my Americanness, with me, it's undeniable. I also feel a level of distance when I'm there too, right? I still feel like the Yankee that they sometimes refer to me as. And so there's just this distance that I feel in both places that I call home. There's this in-betweenness that I feel. And there's a lot of scholars, a lot of Caribbean scholars, especially in writers and poets who've talked about this, like Carol Boyce Davies, Kamau Brathwaite, Derek Walcott, even Indian American scholar Homi Bhabha. They all talk about this kind of in-between space, this limbo space, this liminal space, right? What's interesting for me is that it's in these in-between spaces where a lot of my ideas really form, right? There's this internal curiosity that I have about myself, just wanting to understand the nuances and complexities of myself and be able to trace and track those connections to my family lineage. And when I do that internal work of researching the family archives and having those oral history conversations with family members and returning to my ancestral home in Grenada, and doing research there, from doing that internal work, that then allows me to be able to work more externally, right? To be able to observe my surrounding environment and then respond to my surrounding environment through mediums like public art. So I really think that at its core, what my work is about is about honoring and celebrating my ancestors and our traditions, and then making visible their labor, their ingenuity, their wit, and their contributions that might otherwise be just lost or forgotten. And lost or forgotten because they're intentionally left out of the historical record, or lost or forgotten because of the need to just survive, right? The need to migrate, settle, and integrate into a new society like my family did. And so what I'm interested in is how, through my work and the range of materials that I work in, um, how do I return and how do I reconnect to that ancestral wisdom and history? And then how do I restore and remember and reclaim that history and wisdom, and then use my work to contribute to expanding on its legacy, right? Exploring the endless possibilities of that legacy through my work. And so what you're seeing here is my domiciliation repository number 3 piece. This is part of this larger installation called Domiciliation Bless This House. And this installation was presented during the 2019 Venice Biennale Grenada Pavilion. And this installation in particular is really an outgrowth of the conversations that I had, all the time that I spent with my family throughout 2018, 2019, and quite frankly, even up to this day, I'm still having these conversations with family and doing a lot of this family research. And, you know, I spent a lot of time reconnecting with my family, doing in-person visits, phone conversations, Zoom conversations. And what I just was doing was kind of applying that same level of inquiry and conversation and just curiosity. The same type of approach that I would take with any research that I would do for any other project, I was now starting to apply to my own life and my own family. And so what you're seeing here is me revisiting my family's archives, right? This is the family in Grenada. This is their albums, the photo albums, and I'm going through their family records. And then I even had the chance to finally read my great-grandfather's autobiography, and through that learned so much, and then was exposed to my great uncle's research papers on the history of Grenada as well. So it's like doing all of this, I was just immersing myself and doing this kind of excavation work into my family history. And so now what I'm going to do in this next slide is just go back to the domiciliation, Bless This House installation, and talk about one specific work before segueing into my explorations at Dieu Donné. So this is domiciliation repository number 1. And this is a great example of how I'm incorporating a lot of the photo documentation and records from my family's archive to create this mixed media work that's part of that larger installation that's about reconstructing my family's history and safeguarding my family's history. So the house that you're seeing on screen here in this piece is of my mother's childhood home in Grenada. This is the home that my maternal grandparents built. This home has survived a number of natural and man-made disasters, right? So it survived 2 hurricanes where we lost so much ephemera records that we could never replace. And then this house also survived a house fire that also, again, we lost everything and had to rebuild, but we lost things that we could never replace. So what you're seeing here is me trying to safeguard and hold on to what's left of the family records and history. So I'm using this clear polyvinyl chloride material, this PVC material that's originally designed for like furniture and garment protection. I'm using this here, and I'm silk screening these records and these imagery of my family photos. And if you look closely, you'll see some handwriting, and that handwriting is my grandmother. This is one of her journal entries. She's literally instructing the family on what to do with the house in her absence. So I incorporated that here. And then there's also a land survey of my ancestral home at the base of this piece. And so what I'm doing here is I'm gathering all of these records and imagery and housing it in this kind of gold adorned vessel. And to me, by encasing these memories and these records with the same plastic material that my family would use to cover their furniture and protect the things that they cherish, and it's also the same plastic material that my grandmother, who was a seamstress, would use for her upholstery work. Using that same material, I'm kind of acting like a custodian of this history, right? And so this is just different views of domiciliation repository number one that I wanted to show. So depending on your proximity in relation to the piece, the perspective, your perspective might change. And the transparency allows for things to kind of appear and recede from view, as well as for time and history to feel like it's being compressed. And that's kind of like how memory works, right? It's not linear when you recall something. It kind of comes in different moments, and then you kind of piece it all together, you stitch it all together. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm trying to capture and hold on to a memory. They say that every time you recall a memory, a piece of it gets lost. And so I'm trying to hold and hold a memory in time. Another important detail to mention is the title. So domiciliation means the act of making a country your legal home. And then the subtitle, Bless This House, is actually a gospel song, a very popular gospel song, but I'm referencing here Mahalia Jackson's 1956 rendition of this gospel song, Bless This House. It's a family heirloom. It's been passed on. It's like a family tradition that's been passed on from generation to generation. It started with my great grandmother, Margaret Vincent Mark, and then she loved this song so much she taught herself how to play it on piano, sing it at every family gathering, and then pass her love for this song on to my grandmother's generation. My grandmother's generation passed it on to my mother's generation, and now my mother's generation passed it on to mine. So it's my turn now to pass it on to my son's generation. But I also see an opportunity to pass it on through my artwork, which I'm doing now. And so now here I get to talk about my sense memory explorations at Dieu Donné and how it connects to the previous work. So I love this photo of, this is Tatiana and I working here. And you'll notice that we are working and embedding the pulp into a mold. That mold is actually of my mother's childhood sandals, right? Somehow miraculously, this pair of sandals survived the house fire. We can't explain it to this day, how this little jelly sandals, these plastic sandals, made it through the fire when so many other things didn't, but it did, right? And so my grandfather was able to salvage it, give it to my grandmother. My grandmother travels it to the US, gives it to my mom. And my mom passes it on to me and says, she knows I'm going to do something with this. She wants me to have them. And I've been holding on to these sandals for years, waiting for the right medium, material, technique to work with to tell the story of these shoes and my mother's girlhood and childhood, and connecting that to my girlhood and childhood. And so the opportunity to have this residency, this workspace residency at Dieu Donné, and to learn about the papermaking process was the ideal material to finally realize this work. And so what you're seeing us doing here in the bucket is the pulp, the water, but then I also placed hibiscus, dried hibiscus into the water. And in the Caribbean, it's called sorrel, which is a very popular Caribbean drink. Every island thinks that they make their version of sorrel the best. And then within every family member thinks they make sorrel the best as well. And so I'm embedding the hibiscus into the pulp and water, and then we're embedding that into the mold to create a cast. And I'm going to show you in a few slides what the final work looks like. So again, you know, rather than art supplies, this is my main materials. I'm literally going to my local West Indian and Korean vegetable and herbs shops to source my materials. And as you can see, you could see some of the hibiscus, you're seeing tamarind, you're seeing soursop leaves, black-eyed peas, sugar dish leaves, lemongrass, mabi, which is like a bush tea, Scotch bonnet peppers, spices like saffron and pimento and browning, you know, just a range of ingredients here. And what I'm doing is I'm taking these ingredients and I'm embedding them into the handmade paper to create these handmade paper works as a way what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to preserve my Grenadian family recipes. These recipes, again, have been passed down in an oral tradition through generations of women in my family. And what I'm concerned about is that, my generation, the younger generation, we're not actively preparing these meals anymore. Many of us don't even eat these foods as much anymore, like the previous generations. And so what I'm worried about is that, how will we preserve these recipes if they're not being made, actively being made? They're not written down, and we're not necessarily sharing them orally either. So then how do we preserve them? And what I'm realizing is that, some of these recipes are going to be forever lost with the family members who transition and become ancestors if we don't find a way to log them. So this is my attempt here to capture and preserve these recipes that in the fibers of the paper through my memory work series. And that's what I've been calling these pieces, my memory work series. And what I'm doing is similar to how you prepare any kind of meal, honestly. I am measuring, I'm chopping, I'm combining the ingredients together to create these mixes that I then incorporate into the pulp. And then sometimes, depending on the kind of ingredients I'm using, so if I'm using things like provisions or root vegetables like yams and cassavas and breadfruit and potatoes, those need to be pureed. And then I can incorporate them into the paper pulp to create these types of pieces here. So this is the final piece from the first image where we're embedding the hibiscus into the mold with the pulp. So this is the piece here. It's called Mommy's Holiday Sorrel. Like I said to you, every Caribbean island has their version of sorrel. They think they make it the best. And in each family, everybody thinks they make it the best. So this is my mom's recipe. She likes to make her sorrel very saturated. So she uses a lot of hibiscus. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you my grandmother's sorrel recipe and how how different they are. And then you can see her shoes here, her childhood shoes here. And so now this is my grandmother's holiday sorrel, her version of it. And she uses less hibiscus and more garnish. So what you're seeing that's dyeing the paper, the pulp, is the star anise, the cinnamon, the cloves, as well as the ginger. That's dyeing the pulp here. So, for me, what I wanted to do was, it's from the taste and the smells of these dishes. I was trying to capture in the fibers of the paper as it was my way of trying to form this kind of tangible archive of my family's history, as well as our, cooking or culinary traditions. Okay, so this is morning porridge. And I was thinking a lot about my great grandmother and my grandmother's generation, and how much they lived through. They lived through World War I, the Cold War, Great Depression, World War II, the labor riots in the Caribbean, a lot of illness and famine, just all the things. And, quite frankly, we're kind of going through our own version of that these days. But I was thinking a lot about them, my great grandmother and grandmother's generation, and thinking about the foods that got them through those periods of hardship. And it was really the porridges, the one pot meals, the stews, and the soups, right? And because they needed meals that were simple to make, easy to source, the ingredients would be easy to source. They needed food that was hearty, filling, and can serve many. And they also needed foods and meals that would sustain the family and maintain the health and wellness. And so, and not just, it was important that they sustain the wellness and the health of the younger, so the children as well as the elders as well. And so for this piece here, morning porridge, I was thinking about how it was really important to make sure to give our children porridge to keep them strong and healthy, and so that they can weather through some of those periods of hardship. And it's funny how things haven't changed, even though we're not going through a Great Depression, but things haven't changed much. I still continue these traditions, and my mom did it for me, and my grandmother did it for my mother's generation, and how those traditions of kind of always being prepared for hardship has stayed with us, and it shows through the way we eat, right? The way what we choose to carry forward in our food ways too, which I find quite interesting. It's exactly what I did with my son. I gave him a lot of porridge to strengthen him just in case, right? Kind of this concept of you always stay ready so you never have to get ready kind of concept. And so here is pepper pots. And again, you know, in addition to the ingredients that I'm incorporating into these works, I'm thinking about how each of these pieces also become these textural works, right? Because what I'm doing is I'm recalling the multi-sensory experiences that I would have as a young girl as these meals were being prepared around me, from the women that I was surrounded by, whether my mother, my aunts, my grandmother. I was also thinking about just what the experience I was having when those meals are being prepared. It's kind of like when we hear a song that we haven't heard for a while, you start to think about like where you were, who you were with, what you were wearing, what it smells like. You're having a multi-sensory experience. And so that's what I'm doing here. I'm not only just bringing in the recipe, I'm also bringing in like some of the fabric elements or the things, details around the house or the place that I was in, that also jogs my memory of that time. And I'm trying to capture it in the fibers of the paper as well. And so this is me here, making pepper pot. And so I am mixing the pigmented cotton, Scotch bonnet peppers, black eyed peas, the pureed, and I'm creating these purees with coconut milk, callaloo, which is like it's a green like spinach, dashin leaves, another green, green plantains, breadfruit, chana peas, red and green peppers, onions, turmeric, saffron. I mean, all of the things. This is also pumpkin soup. Again, another one pot meal I was talking about earlier. This has it's another puree I made. So pumpkin, carrots, corn kernels. There's an actual seasoning that we use from time to time called Caribbean Dreams. And actually the packet is the same kind of ochre color like the piece here. And it has the curry, the turmerics, and then I incorporated ground provisions like yams and potato in this piece, along with the fabric trimming. And the fabric trimming is recalling the home that I was in with the kind of valance and the fringe that would hang from those valance, the curtains that I remember. And then this here, again, another one pot stew. This is called pilau. This is very popular in Grenada, one of our staple meals. And again, I'm mixing pigmented cotton, black eyed peas, browning, callaloo, just coconut milk, cassava, pimento, the yams, the rice, breadfruit, all of it. But one of the things I'm also adding here is the palm leaves, because what I was thinking about was the time of year, when I remember having these meals, and I connected to our spiritual traditions, our spiritual holidays. I was thinking about Easter, Lent, Palm Sunday, and how during Palm Sunday you'll get the palms from church, and everyone would be making all of these special knots and ties with the palms and giving it out to family and friends and hanging it in their homes. And so I'm recalling that here in this work. And so, you know, for me, what I'm realizing as I try to capture these recipes is that by me adding these particular ingredients, I'm also telling the history of Grenada through these ingredients and these recipes, right? I'm able to tell the story of like the first Amerindian inhabitants who like cultivated the vegetation of the land, right? When I add those root vegetables, right? I'm able to tell the story of my enslaved West African ancestors who were brought to the island in the 18th century by telling the recipes of, or presenting the recipes of the stews and the one pot meals. And then I'm even able to also share through the use of those, the golden spices that I was showing you earlier in pepper pot and pumpkin soup, with the turmeric and the saffron. I'm able to introduce the South Asian influence in the 19th century that came to the island as indentured migrants at the time. you know, their contribution to the cuisine and the way we season our foods in Grenada. And so through these ingredients, we're able to tell the story of all of the folks who make up Grenada, their contributions to the island, and also I'm able to just recount my family's history. And you know, as we migrate from Grenada to the United States. So I'm just realizing, you know, and really showing a level of appreciation for, you know, the intuitiveness and the expression that I inherited from my family, specifically the women in my family. And then I also just want to thank Dieu Donné, you know, and show a lot of gratitude and appreciation to the team at Dieu Donné for the impact that they've had on my process and my work, because now I'm able to tell the story of my family, expand how I tell the story of my family, how I expand and tell the story, my story, through papermaking, which, you know, like as you can see in the earlier slide of me continuing the work, how much it's influencing my work and my process. So, and I think this is a great time to invite Tatiana back so we can chat a bit.
Thank you so much, Shervone. It's so fun for me to kind of look at this work now with a little bit of distance on it. You know, we were so involved in the process at the time, but also, I mean, I'm so struck by just almost like a olfactory memory of what the studio smelled like, with everyone walking by was like, what is going on? This is amazing. And is that for lunch? Because I'd love to eat it. You know, people were so entranced by the smells and everything. But also what's interesting to me is, you know, looking back at your process, you made a lot of things and then re-embedded them or reworked them, all of the fabrics and the trim that you put on later, but also things that you know, for those of you who are in the audience who have made paper, some of these things were made and tried and then re-embedded and added to. So it was very much the way that perhaps you know, you might work with whatever's left over in your kitchen, right?
Right. That's right. Leftovers.
Yeah, leftovers, exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Remember you brought those black-eyed peas that you see right under your hand as
Yes.
something that you brought on the first day instead of like, you know, that you had made those before and wanted to work with them. And then, you know, it's so interesting to think about that.
Yes. Yeah. I do a lot of that. There's like things where, you know, you have ideas, they come to you, you explore, and then they're not fully realized. They're like drafts of things that just stay. And I'm okay with sitting on something for a long time until the medium speaks to me. It's like all of a sudden, like somehow a Rolodex or a file cabinet in my brain is like, oh, I know what I have that would go perfectly with this thing, and then I'm able to piece it all together. And so, yeah, that black eyed peas is years ago. I made that. If I'm correct, don't quote me on it, but I think it stems back from a residency I did at the Center for Book Arts years ago. Originally, I was looking at them as pages. And but I wasn't satisfied with it and decided to sit on it for a while until the right medium and opportunity came to tell that story. And so years later, here I am, finally incorporating them into the work.
I think that's such a great theme that runs through all of your work, is this kind of sorting of the archive and thinking about things and shelving things for later, saving materials. You know, I loved kind of looking again at the sandals. And I remember, you know, at the beginning when you first came in for your first sort of experimental day, talking about your grandmother's sandals and how you wanted to work with them, and just thinking, you know, that was something that was like an anchor in a way for your project, right? It was one of the things that was like, okay, if we can cast these sandals, which are so charming and wonderful, you know, then what do you build off of that? Or how do you kind of give them a place. You know, they're what new life can they live? And also I love that they look, you know, like they've lived a life, like somebody wore them and, you know, they were really used and kind of loved.
Mhm.
That's such a nice thing to see.
Yeah, I remember. That's right. It was after we did that tour, like the first visit with you all, where we got to just experiment and look at just the possibilities of what we can do with paper. Just to get us thinking about, like, you know, what do we want to do? Like, how much options do we have, right? And that's when I knew I wanted to work with bring the sandals in. And what's so interesting is that originally my plan was, and I don't know if you remember this, my plan was to continue the domiciliation series with the plastic at Dieu Donné. That was the goal, was to continue
Yeah.
building on that work. And then all of a sudden, as I started to look around and see what I can do, I was like, that was abandoned completely. And I just wanted to like bring in the shoes. And I realized later on that actually there is a direct connection. Those shoes came from that house that survived. Like, this is one of the rare things that actually survived. The strangest thing to survive, but the thing that survived, this little girl's shoes, my mother's shoes. And so I am telling the story, but now I'm just using another medium to tell that story through. And so the story continues, you know, a new chapter of it continues through paper, which I love this idea of, you know, because you know, they say about how important it is for us to write down and tell our own story, but even with something written, you know, if you write something down, it still can be altered, it still can be manipulated, but there's something about embedding the story into the fibers of the paper, right? That the story is the paper, that I was really interested in exploring more.
Yeah, I think you really explored that well with this project. And it you know, I think just all of us kind of looking at it can conjure some memories or some different kinds of things. We each bring our own thing to it, but we have a sort of visceral understanding of some of that, even if we don't understand all of the stories that you would have associated. We feel some of those things that connect. And that's you know, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about with your project is how paper maybe has also kind of connected to or influenced the other work that you're doing. And I think that it's, you know, it's such a natural outgrowth of some of the other projects that you've done to work in paper. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about, has paper influenced sort of how you treat the plastic or other materials that kind of you encounter? Or do you feel like it's goes back and forth?
It's funny because you know what I'm starting to do now. Well, as I continue exploring paper, what I'm doing now is I just want to continue to keep embedding, but now embed objects. So I've been going around to certain family members and literally taking objects that they would let me have that are like real memories for me. So like for instance, my mom has these like table coverings, or like they're kind of like doilies, but not crocheted. They're just fabric, and they're stained and used. And she doesn't even use them anymore, but she still holds on to them like they're keepsakes now, because they represent like our different locations where we lived throughout New York. And so she's still holding on to them, even though they're like falling apart. And I asked her if I could have it because I remember that piece. And there's something about telling the story of that object and embedding that into the paper, and then also incorporating the recipes where we would have food and converse and, you know, and gather with that object. So that object also has history, but I also recognize that if I don't ask for it, it might just end up in the garbage at some point. So this is my way of preserving it. So there's this kind of marrying of the object and the paper, and it having another life as a result of me overlapping the paper, or embedding it into the paper that I'm interested in now. So more objects, embedding of objects, and covering objects with paper too.
That's great. I think Hannah's got some Q&A questions to ask you from our chat.
Mhm.
Yeah, definitely. And for everyone with us, please submit your questions. And thanks for everyone who has submitted already. So we have numerous questions to the same effect about how you approach, how you feel about using materials that may not be long lasting, how you approach the archival nature of your artwork that serves as an archive for your family history, especially with all the food that you incorporate.
Yeah, yes. Good one. Learned a lot of things because they're chemical reactions. But for the most part, that's another reason why I've tried to stick to the herbs and the spices and the grains, because that can be preserved. And of course, some of them need help. So like acrylic sealants and things like that to help cure it and kind of hold it in time. While others, again, I learned the hard way. There was one that had like a little infestation, and learned about like certain spices that need to be, there's a certain point where I need to let it dry, and that I definitely need to cure it with the acrylic um, sealants immediately. If I don't, then the infestation is going to happen. So sometimes I'm not able to get that nice, just maintain that nice paper surface, that matted look. I'm going to have to seal it, or else I have to prepare myself for unwanted guests, you know? So, and I had a lot of conversation around with paper conservators around this, because conservation, preservation, of course, because you've heard how we've already lost a lot of history through hurricanes and, you know, man-made disasters. So of course it's a top of mind, but there is a way to hold the process. If I have to be just very vigilant at a certain point in the drying stage to um, to cure it, or else and seal it, or else then it can decay. So it's been a lot of experimenting with that, but I'm getting better at it.
I mean, it's always a process. And I remember that infestation, and it was really kind of an activation of the work in,
Yes, it was.
in our gallery. There's a question. Also, when I summarized everyone's questions, I eliminated a lot of questions about how inspiring, wonderful, and how much people have loved seeing your work.
Thank you.
And I don't want to skip those comments. There's also a question about uh, what the names were of the Caribbean writers who talked about liminal space.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. So there is Carol Boyce Davies is one, Carole, Boyce Boyce, Davies Davies. And then there's Kamal Brathwaite. I might do that. Kamau Brathwaite. I don't want to butcher it and get it wrong. I think it's like Braithwaite. And then there's Derek Walcott as well. And oh, Derek Derek Walcott, Walcott. And then there is Homi Baba, uh, Homi, and then I think it's Bhabba. Uh, please don't quote me on this. Please do your research and look it
I think
up.
that if everyone Googles it to the best they can, Google autocorrect will
Yes,
suggest the right
yes,
spelling.
yes, yes. That's
Yeah,
right.
we don't need to put you on the spot too much. We have another question and a compliment. Amazing presentation, Shervone. Have you had the opportunity to show work in Grenada?
No. Okay, so had the amazing opportunity to represent Grenada, but not yet had the opportunity to bring work to Grenada. It's funny. I would love that, but I am also um, I'm protective of my time in Grenada, and I don't want it to become too transactional. I really want this to be like it is a sacred space. When I'm home, I'm home. I just want to be coddled by family, eat, chat, reconnect, enjoy the land, do a lot of sourcing of materials, do a lot of research, speak to the folks who know a lot about Grenada. I just want to spend that time sourcing. But I would love one day um, to share this work, you know, in Grenada, see what the response is. But right now, what serves me is when I am able to share it wherever, whether internationally here in the States, and Caribbean folks, you know, approach and show excitement because they know it. As soon as they see it, they know what I'm talking about, or they connect, or and not only just Caribbean, everyone have a story. Somehow the material that I'm using, they have a memory. And then folks always say, you know what this reminds me of? I remember when. And then I know the work is doing exactly what I want it to do. But yes, pie in the sky dream to show in Grenada, of course. But again, like I said, it's sacred space, so I don't want to work too much.
That makes a lot of sense. Um, Someone else asks, you talked about labor in your role as daughter, firstborn grandchild, and mother. Do you think of your work as a kind of kin keeping in translating the oral tradition of ancestral recipes into papermaking?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, I realize I come from a family who are orators, who are writers, they storytellers, and clearly my role was to do it in visual form.
Absolutely. There's also a question about family. That it's incredible to see so much more of your processes and body of work. And thank you for sharing your thought process with us. I know you've collaborated with family members through conversations, archives. This question comes from Anna Benjamin, I should say. So she knows that you've collaborated with family members through conversations, archives, heirlooms, images, textiles, and recipes. Is there any element of family collaboration inside the studio?
Ooh. Ha, it's funny. It's funny because just this weekend, you know, collaboration doesn't only mean in the making of the work, right? It's also in the keeping of your space, right? Like the workspace. And so my brother was just here with me this weekend helping me. I've done some much needed construction updates on my studio, and he was here helping me. And that's a form of caring for me, caring for my space, and encouraging me to keep the work going. So that was another type of collaboration. And it's funny because in that collaboration, we were just talking. He would come across work or like drafts of things and then ask me about it. And then I would say, you remember when, or, you know, when we did this thing, I took some of that material with me, and we just have conversation. And you know, he would ask me some questions, kind of like how everyone's asking me here. And it causes me to think about why I'm doing what I'm doing. There's things that hasn't made a presence in the world yet that he's asking me about too. And it gives me a chance to think about, yeah, what is the intention or the agenda behind that piece. So it's funny how collaborations are happening in many different forms for me. It's not just in the physical art making, but yes, collaborations do happen. Like one of my public art pieces that I did, the Lunar Portal project that unveiled last year in Pittsburgh. In the ideation phase, I kind of consulted with my parents because it connected to both their lives. Like the portal was going to be installed at a hospital, and I wanted to get a perspective of, like, you know, what what does someone who's at a hospital working every day want to encounter as an art object that's in their space all the time. And so I talked to my father about his experience in hospitals and what would he want to see. And then the space was supporting folks with vision impairments, and my mother has a vision impairment. And so talking to her about, like, well, what would be something she would want to see and engage with, and what are things that are harmful that we don't necessarily think about um, in the world, because some of us don't have vision impairments, and so we don't think like that. So engaging her, it's funny how I end up, you know, uh, uh, just engaging family around things and their experiences so that they can inform the work that I make.
It's so interesting hearing you talk about the nature of collaboration within your practice because Dieu Donné is so focused on the idea of a professional collaborator and how an artist can come in from a different practice and work with an artist who is a expert paper maker, and that you're bringing in these like multiple forms of the idea of collaboration.
Mhm.
Um,
Yes.
oh, go
Yeah,
ahead.
collaboration is huge for me. I think folks who know me know how I feel about working in teams, working as a group, working publicly, because there's just something about how you get transformed every time you collaborate with someone. Even if you're like Tatiana and I work together, but her hand is in the work too. Like her hands were in a lot of those spices too. So she has touched the work and touched me and inspired and informed and educated. And so the work is forever changed, right? Like my practice has shifted as a result of that. So I appreciate those collaborations and connections.
And vice versa
Um,
too. We love that aspect of collaborating, that having an artist they come in with something special and particular. And so we learn from that. I learned from that. So thank you.
Thank you.
we have a very nitty-gritty practical question. Are the trimmings attached by hand sewing?
Sometimes depends on the the thickness of the paper that I made, or just like the stability. Some of them are super thin, some of them are thicker and can handle it. Sometimes I'm literally just using what is it, the PVA glue, the PVA glue, like the bookbinding glue, the stick glue. Other times, yeah, I am sewing or just tacking sometimes. And then every now and then, maybe a glue gun, depending. But most of the time, it's like the bookbinder's glue and yeah, tacking.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And then I think that this is a great final question. How do you sort out failed experiments from future work ingredients? Thinking of the Black Eyed Peas pages here. And also thank you for sharing your work and family history with us.
You know what? I don't see anything as failed. I just leave them up, put them to the side, um, and they're drafts. They will inform something else. Like I think Tatiana and Anna Benjamin uh, will. They've seen me bring something that I said I made years ago, probably older than my son, who's 11, to the studio. And I was like, I made this years ago, but I know exactly what I want to do with this. I'm going to embed this into this paper. Like it just needs time. So don't give up on it. That's why I love going to things like antique shops, vintage shops, because we're always reviving things. It's just not the right time for it. So just hold on to it. I know that might sound like hoarding, but not, you'll know the thing to throw away and the thing to keep.
Is there anything besides the Black Eyed Peas that you brought in to Dieu Donné from your archive of drafts?
I'm trying to think here. Archive of, well, some of the fabric trimming, a lot of the fabric trimming is old trimming. Like I like to collect things and just have sit. So the fabric trimming is sitting there too. And I'm pairing these things. They're not something I go out and buy. A lot of this stuff is either I collected from family, I rip off of clothes, um, blankets, materials, or just things I've collected over time. And again, sitting there waiting for the right opportunity, and then I piece them, I assemble them.
That makes a lot of sense. So I think that we're just about at 2 p.m. So I want to say thank you to everyone who joined us. And of course, I want to thank Shervone for sharing this amazing presentation with us. We're so glad that you could join us today.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate everyone for joining.